Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. Thank you very much for your patience as we worked through some minor technical difficulties, but I'm very happy to be here in this very special edition of the Chitheads podcast. Normally we record these behind closed doors, as it were, but today I thought it would be lovely to interview Samir Chopra about his book, Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide. So hello, Samir. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much for having me on, Jacob. It's great to be here.
It's a real pleasure to get to meet you and to talk to you about your book. I actually saw you in person once before. I'll speak about that in just a second. I just wanted to mention to everybody here that we will have an opportunity to turn it over to some questions towards the end of Samir and I's conversation today. So if you have some questions as they arise, please do put them right into the chat so that when we get to that 45, 50-minute point, there's some questions there raring to go. Because if I don't see any sort of straight away, I'll just keep talking to Samir. So as soon as you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and we will peruse for those questions when we get to that portion of the conversation. So the story, it's a little bit different than usual. Usually I discover, folks that I interview through various kinds of online research, but I was actually in Boulder, Colorado in this past April, actually on a retreat to cope with some of my own anxiety symptoms. I was doing a psychedelic therapy retreat at the Center for Medicinal Mindfulness. I think I had done maybe 2 psilocybin journeys when I had made my way into downtown Boulder, gone to the, I think it's the Boulder bookstore. Is that what it is, Samir? Boulder
That's right,
bookstore?
Boulder Bookstore.
Wonderful bookstore. Oh my gosh, like my kind of bookstore, great mixture of sort of, traditional bookstore meets spirituality and everything in between. Such an amazing bookstore. But I got there maybe 10 minutes before your interview, which I didn't know anything about. I saw that they were having this event, and I saw your book. And I mean, the cover itself is very attractive. Perfect kind of like 70s sort of seemingly retro fusion. Very much my aesthetic. So I saw the book. I also felt anxiety, philosophers, and then I also noticed by leafing through the book that you explored anxiety from a number of different perspectives, number of different traditions, including Western ones and ones from contemplative traditions, particularly Buddhism. And so it was right up my alley. So I decided to join for that interview. It was a wonderful conversation. And I knew after picking up the book that I had to get you on the podcast. So here we are. And so let's start at the beginning, I guess, or rather at the origin of your own philosophical journey, which it seems to you is the beginning of philosophy is anxiety for you. So I'd kind of love to talk a little bit about the experience of your anxiety prior to your kind of philosophical exploration and how you connected philosophy to anxiety. So what was that experience like prior to kind of your philosophical healing, as it were?
Um, Thanks very much for that really rich introduction, Jacob. And thank you too for connecting the contents of the book or the discussions of the book to my personal relationship with anxiety. Um, the book grew out of an essay that I wrote. I started working on almost 10 years ago, which was to describe my personal relationship to anxiety. I'd been in therapy for 5 years before that. I'd been studying philosophy for, at the doctoral level, been a professor for a while, and a lifelong sufferer of anxiety. And when I thought about what I took to be the foundational events in my life in the way that I first conceived it, these were a pair of personal bereavements. I lost my parents early in my life, and in radically different fashion. I lost my father when I was 12. I lost my mother when I was 26. I lost my father to a sudden heart attack at home. I lost my mother to a protracted illness, to breast cancer. So these were sort of radically different deaths. One was sudden, of one I had fair warning, and I was, given all the warning I needed in some sense, but it was still unexpected in its own particular way. And I think the way I connected that to my personal anxiety was that it made the world a kind of threatening place. In some ways, the portals of fatal possibility, as I described it, had been opened. In some ways, anything was possible now. I understood that in some way there was a kind of a reasonableness demand that I had placed on the universe. There was some limit of cruelty or indifference that the universe couldn't cross, right? There was this mentally imposed barrier I had imposed on the universe. You're not just going to do these kinds of things to me. And actually, I found out that the universe can. It can do just about anything it wants. And I think that was a shocking revelation, one that sort of, use whatever metaphor you want, pull the rug out from under my feet, open the trapdoors, made me aware of the depths that lurked below, of the abysses. We can go on with these descriptions.
Mhm.
The idea is that I became extremely fearful and anxious. Anything was possible, after all, right? Which, of course, is the paradigmatic state of anxiety, that you are scared, you are fearful, you know not quite of what. Your mind can turn itself to any eventuality. So the world lurks with dangers in some ways. And of course, anxiety doesn't always manifest itself as fear of the unknown. It bubbles up in different ways. It can restrict us from participating fully in life. It can make us angry. It can make us sedate ourselves through a variety of substances. It can manifest itself in a host of what psychiatrists might call mental disorders. So, and then of course, when I started to turn to philosophy, it was because I found myself brought there, pushed there by finding out that philosophical texts offered relief of some sort, temporary, because after all, when you close the book, you went back to being anxious again. But sometimes they changed your perspective, the vantage points from which you could stand and take in, the world's offerings, and give you different perspectives on what all of this meant. When I went to therapy, I found out that I hadn't just become anxious, I'd always been anxious.
Mm.
And the more I thought about anxiety, the more I studied philosophy, the more it seemed to me that my being anxious was neither particularly bizarre or exceptional or weird. It almost was the way that we human beings were constituted. And when I further reflected upon it philosophically, using the resources that I now had, it seemed to me that in fact the existential conditions of our life, of our existence, the so called existential trifecta, right? That we live in finite time, that we are mortal, and that we are conscious of these two parameters, that we are mortal and live in finite time. This guarantees anxiety. I mean, I would probably add a fourth condition in there, that we're concerned about the future. If we weren't concerned about the future, we wouldn't be anxious. But we're concerned about the future, and we have incomplete epistemic capacities, the ability to acquire knowledge about the future. Now we're in a bind.
Mm.
Time's running out. I'm conscious of this fact. I want to know what's going to happen, but I really cannot find out with perfect certainty.
Mm.
So I'm concerned, I'm fearful, I'm anxious. So I think in some ways, I think philosophy brought me to these various passages of reflecting upon my state, but I'd come to it because events in my life had turned me away from a complacent attitude towards existence and made me realize that this is all a bit, it's all a bit contingent,
Mm.
right? It's a bit put together, and it could fall apart in all these ways, right? And I think it's that possibility which is always sort of lurking at the edge of our minds, which I think is the hallmark of a certain kind of anxiety. In my book, of course, there's all these different traditions that I go through, and we can talk about those. But I think the passageway for me was, as you put it, was to be scared out of my mind by what had just happened to an aspect of the universe that I thought was invulnerable. My parents.
Mm. Mhm.
I mean, they're like folks that brought me into this universe. I
Yeah.
imagine them solid, right?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of your book, when you're kind of reflecting on this personal story. I mean, even though the specifics of your story with regards to the tragedy of your parents' loss is, probably unique for a lot of us. Many of us are lucky enough to have parents that survive into to at least a little bit of our later years, our mid-age years, middle age years. But the way in which you kind of craft that narrative, it just it really resonates, and I'm sure anybody who reads it will feel that just how universal this experience is, and that can be really comforting in a way, because I think a lot of people are kind of, I don't know, enculturated, or because of the pressure of their anxieties, feel kind of alone in that experience. And so, what your book did for me was really, pointed to kind of the universality of this experience, and obviously depending on the tradition, and we'll talk about those, how that anxiety, that existential, condition is situated is different depending on from which tradition you look at it from. But there is this kind of thread throughout that this is sort of a pervasive and universal condition that we all can relate to differently, right? It isn't this sort of, well, maybe we want to talk about that next. It's not necessarily, or at least you push back against this idea that anxiety is purely sort of a kind of mechanistic, brain chemistry imbalance, and that it is purely something that can be sort of ameliorated by various, psychiatric substances, but rather that there's, it's not simply that, but there's this deeper meaning to anxiety, or rather there are multiple kind of meanings. That's really what I took away as well from your book, that there's this kind of multidimensionality to the exploration of meaning when it comes to anxiety, and those variable kind of approaches to anxiety don't necessarily always, they sometimes contradict each other, and yet there's still something valuable in that variable exploration. So I want to ask you about that, but I do want to just mention, because for those that are interested in getting the book, and if you're not able to stay with us for the full interview, this is the book Anxiety: A Philosophical Guide by Samir Chopra. It is, I also wanted to mention at the beginning, it is one of the most beautiful books that I've read recently. It's very, with a lot of the types of books that I read for this podcast or for my own study, there's a lot of, fact, very academic, kind of abstruse, dry stuff. But your not only is the book so rich with ideas, but it's also just very beautifully written, and that's such a pleasure. So it's also just a very pleasurable book. So I wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Yes. So tell us about this. I guess let's just start from this idea, the current kind of cultural assumptions that we have about anxiety, and kind of what is that fundamental obstacle that kind of is socialized into us about anxiety that we kind of need to overcome, or will overcome through this kind of philosophical adventure or search.
Thanks. I think that's a really rich question. By the way, I just want to say, since I have my eyes on the YouTube channel on all the people that we got live, there's been a couple of complaints about the sound. So I wonder if we need to be speaking closer to the mic or if anything like that. But I'll hopefully folks will let us know.
Is the sound, is it related to, is it mine specifically? Is it Samir's for those that are listening? Is it both microphones? Is it one microphone? If it's a general sound, I'm not sure, there's not much that I can do if it's just kind of general YouTube sound. I just don't really have the time right now to fix that. So I would
No
say
worries.
turn up the volume as much as you can
Yeah.
wherever you are.
The old crude method.
Yeah, it says his sound is not the best. I'm not sure who the he is here.
Right.
Samir's sound. Okay, so maybe are you separate from your mic, Samir? Is it?
Yeah, just sort of speaking into the machine. I actually never use a separate mic but I'm
Are
gonna
you on a
try.
Mac?
Yes, I'm on a Mac.
Okay, so if you go into let me see, microphone.
Yeah, my
Okay, if
mic's
go to sound system preferences, go into sound,
uh-huh.
and then go to input, and then click on the you can drag it to the right, and perhaps that, if it's not dragged all the way to the right, you might be able to increase the input volume.
Okay. Just trying to get the system preferences. Okay, great. Uh,
Oh, now I can't hear you. Whoops, let's see here.
any
What's
better
the
now?
output going on? MacBook Pro speakers output.
Can you hear me now?
Samir, now
Ah,
I can't hear you.
it just said Samir's sound is low volume. Uh, no, I'm gonna just close all the.
Okay, we're going to have to pause the recording and we will be back in just a second because I'm going to have to reboot this. So apologies to
Oh,
everyone. We'll
really?
be right back.
Oh,
All right, we are back. Sorry about that, everybody. And yes, apologies. It's difficult to kind of manage all the tech details when we're going live. So what if there is some kind of technical difficulty, then perhaps by the end of our conversation, we'll have strategies for you to ameliorate the anxiety of tech
sort it out.
disruptions. Okay, so back to what we were speaking about before, Samir. So
Right,
just this question of kind of our kind of cultural assumptions about anxiety and how your work is kind of
right.
suggesting a new approach to it.
So there's, you mentioned the conflicts between the different traditions that I cover in the book, and I think that's one way to think about the way in which we as a culture think about anxiety. And I think part of my motivation for writing the book was to definitely, as it were, change some of the ways in which we think about anxiety, right? So there are a couple of broad based cultural assumptions that I think are out there. One of them, of course, is what I would call the medicalized assumption, right? That anxiety is a psychiatric condition. And this is to be treated with psychiatric medications, right? Anti anxiety medications are very common. And in fact, precisely because anti anxiety medications have not just one effect, but a variety of effects, we often see people taking anti anxiety medications for afflictions that are not anxiety. For example, there are people who are taking anxiety medications to help them sleep, for instance, right? So, okay, so that's one. There's anxiety that's kind of understood as a medical condition, right? Then there's another way in which anxiety is at some level understood, implicitly or explicitly, that it has something to do with the way that we have organized our world. I think people do have some inkling that this is a cultural issue, this is a political issue, if we may want to go that far. That in some ways, the ways in which we have chosen to organize the world, to relate to each other, to live with each other, this is making us anxious, right? And I think social theorists have been beaten on this drum for a couple of hundred years now. Like, look around you. What do you expect? You're bound to be anxious, right?
Yeah.
That's true. And at the same time, I think this other cultural assumption goes along with it, which is that, well, it's a medical condition. And so if we were to treat this medical condition, well, we would bring relief and an end to the suffering and misery of, of anxiety. And guess what? That would make all of us functional and happier than ever before, right? So there's a suspicions, I think, floating around in the minds of many, which is expressed in a lot of the critical literature and theory and philosophy and political theorizing in this domain, and lots of other psychological theorizing as well. That in fact we might be medicating something which is, which is a matter of perhaps personal and political reflection. Perhaps there's something suspicious about the fact that anxiety makes us dysfunctional in a society in which we are needed to be functional and highly productive, right? Which has always been the worry with antidepressants. Like, one of the things that antidepressants will do, even if they leave you with a diminished libido, is that they will get you off the couch and back to work, right?
Mm.
And you'll hear a lot of people, anxious people, say they just want to be functional. And a lot of people who are around anxious people want them to be functional. So anxiety is a massive topic in our day and age, and we often do suspect that the material conditions of our day and age are often making us anxious. These very technological aids that are facilitating our conversation today are sometimes held to make us more anxious, right? There's something about being trapped in this gigantic surveillance machine that's constantly harvesting our data for financial gain. That description just seems to make me anxious, right?
Mhm.
So there is this, I think, understanding amongst us that we are being made anxious by the world, that the solutions to it are needed and critical, if not just for our own happiness, because we need to keep the world ticking along, as it were, right? So there's medication, there's a lot of self help, and there's often a lot of relief promised from anxiety, that you can be anxiety free. So I think the intervention that my book makes in this entire sort of febrile space, so to speak,
Mhm.
is that it points out that anxiety is sort of as old as the hills because it finds its expression in philosophy. Philosophers have been thinking about this, they've been concerned about it. We might not be using the word anxiety, but when you describe the phenomenology of the states that we're talking about, yeah, we're talking about people who are pretty anxious out here in many different ways. And so
Mhm.
some of the interventions I would say are, one is that anxiety is in some ways, as I put it, constitutive of existence. Here's a little punchline: to be is to be anxious. So, in some ways, perhaps we need to reconceptualize anxiety. After all, if anxiety is a feature of existence, then it seems a mistake to classify it as a pathology, something that we need to try and medicate out of existence. Maybe if it's the kind of thing that just is the case with us and we are bound to be anxious, then we should understand its place in our life a little bit differently. So, part of what the book is trying to do is to help us understand anxiety differently, reconceptualize it, think about it differently. And I say at the beginning of the book, I can't promise you a cure for anxiety. There is none. I hate to tell you this, you are going to be anxious. But you don't have to suffer from a kind of a pernicious meta anxiety,
Mhm.
which is that you don't have to be anxious about being anxious. You should just accept the fact that you are going to be anxious. You're going to live with anxiety. Well, we need to think about our strategies for living with anxiety, coping with it, ameliorating it perhaps to some extent. We don't have to make our anxiety worse by the way we live, by the way we organize our societies, by the way we treat each other. So that intuition is correct. We are making ourselves anxious, but we're making ourselves anxious, more anxious than we need to be. There's a certain quanta of anxiety that we've been dealt, and that's quite enough. Thank you very much. Freud once said, the purpose of therapy, sorry, quite a Freudian slip there. The purpose of therapy was to get us from hysterical misery to common unhappiness. Common unhappiness is just the human condition, right? We're dissatisfied, things aren't quite right, we know we're going to die, and so on and so forth. Life is hard, but we don't have to make it worse by constructing our world in such a way that we are made even more anxious. Because no matter which bend we turn, no matter which corner we take, our basic existential anxiety is always there waiting for us. That's the basement dweller. It's always there. Even people who are medicated, right? They might relieve themselves of some kinds of anxiety, like perhaps the economic anxiety of losing a job or other things, or that crippling anxiety that renders them dysfunctional. But they're not going to free themselves of fundamental existential anxiety.
Mhm.
And I would say, actually, as I wrote the book, I came to understand anxiety a little bit differently myself, as I've come to understand it
Mm.
over a period of time, as I've come to become more of a father and, someone who lives at home with my wife, my daughter. come to understand the role that love has in our lives, I've come to think that anxiety in its fundamental forms is the fear of death or the consciousness of our finite existence, if I was to be more precise. And the second one is something that I think Freud glommed onto. Anxiety is the fear of the loss of love. And so many forms of behavior become comprehensible when we trace them to a fear of the loss of love underwriting them, right? And I think this is quite a deep insight by Freud, that there's a kind of, we lost love once and we're scared to lose it again. And we might have symbolized it in different ways. Could be my high school teacher, my friend who doesn't return my text message in time, my boss who doesn't praise me enough, or all these anonymous people in social media who don't give me as many retweets and likes as I would like for myself. These all become, sort of like manifestations of the lack of love that the universe has for me. And, when we speak
Yeah.
about, when we glibly assign the term anxiety to these various insecurities and fears that we have, I think fear of the loss of love makes those more comprehensible as well. So I think the diversity of traditions that I talk about in the book, they sometimes point, much like the mythical elephant who's approached by the men who are incapacitated in different ways. Sometimes there's that partial perspective, but I think they just point out that we respond to the fact of existence, to the bare facts of existence in different ways. So the anxiety that you
Yeah.
find in Buddhism and the anxiety that you find in existential treatments is a little bit different, but it's also deeply related as well, right?
Yeah, let's dive into each one of these a little bit. But you kind of brought up a very, I didn't realize how appropriate it kind of is that following the last episode of this podcast, we're having this conversation because it seems like maybe you knew that we did an episode on Jainism and if you didn't, then that's very auspicious because we were speaking actually about anekantavada and about the many-sidedness of reality and how these different traditions can have, they're equally true, they're partially true, and together we can combine them to kind of approach, a larger and more and a broader sense of what the truth is. And so how appropriate then that this conversation is now exploring kind of, applying that in some way to actually the topic of anxiety. So let's proceed through as you did in your book and start with Buddhism. I think that's where you started, which seems appropriate since it's kind of the most metaphysical. Well, you could say they were all kind of metaphysical in a way, but since Buddhism says, there is dukkha, right? There is this word that's often translated as suffering, although I think you don't necessarily think that's you don't like that interpretation. Is that correct? You
No,
think
I would
dukkha
say
is
actually
somewhat
suffering is a
misunderstood?
common translation, but any examination of Buddhist literature will show you that there's actually a variety of meanings and connotations that can be attached to the word, because there is dissatisfaction, there's fear, there's sadness. These are all forms of dukkha, right? They're forms of suffering because each one of them involves a certain kind of suffering. So many of these many of these terms then are packaged in what I would call a general dissatisfaction or unease with existence, right? And so to locate anxiety in here is not to say that the Buddha specifically says that, after all, there's no term for anxiety in that sense. But that sense that we have, that there is my fear, and sometimes, and I think it's a kind of what I call anticipatory fear. For example, I do not know anything about how I will die, right? But if I do experience my death in its full phenomenology with all its discomforts and so on and so forth, there's an unease I have now about how I will be reacting at that moment, right? So, built into the state of trepidation that I have about my future states, about old age, about death, about infirmity, is what I would call anticipatory fear. And that's a kind of anxiety because I don't quite know what it will be like, but I shrink from it now, right? Secondly, there's what I call the sort of the gray lining on the silver cloud. Even when everything is okay, I have a sense that this could end, that this could run out. And the universe has brutally reminded me of, and others, of this fact in a variety of ways. Like children find out, the ice cream runs out at the bottom of the cone. It was all great up till then, and then you hit the bottom of the cone and there's no more ice cream. Right? The fact that good things come to an end. And in fact, it doesn't really matter how good it is, it will come to an end.
It's gonna
And in
end.
fact, if it stays good for too long, you'll be sated. So there's this kind of like, even if I get the good thing, it's not all that great, right? So that's the dissatisfaction aspect of it. Now, of course, what's crucial about the Buddhist approach to understanding anxiety is that anxiety is rooted in a kind of confusion about who and what we are. It's rooted in certain kinds of failures of knowledge, in certain kinds of failures of realization. You don't understand what you are, and you don't understand the nature of the universe, and you need to come to realize this. You're not going to find this truth hidden underneath a rock. You need to come to this realization by yourself through a series of, you know, disciplined intellectual and philosophical adventures of the mind, perhaps. But there are failures of knowledge. First, you have not paid attention to the fact that the world is eternally changing. It is dynamic and transient. Nothing endures, nothing abides. Secondly, everything is dependent upon everything else. There is quite literally nothing that is independent of everything else there is. The notion of interdependent arising. So, for me to imagine that my happiness, my existence can be free of everything that is around me is a kind of failure of knowledge. It is a profound failure of knowledge, right? There is also a failure for me to understand, which is probably the most and the deepest Buddhist lesson of all, that the enduring self that I ascribe to myself, the I, the ego, the it, Jacob, Samir, this enduring identity that you imagine, this thing is not to be found. But notice how many of my anxieties stem from the fact that I ascribe to myself an identity that is isolated from the rest of all of reality, which has a separate independent end and beginning, which has its own ambitions, its own memories, its own future, its own past, which is, quite frankly speaking, selfish. Because that's what selves do. Selves are selfish. They're self centered. They claim things for themselves. They get worried when they lose things. They're concerned about the end of their lives. They're worried about their children, their cars. They get upset when people don't review their books as favorably as other philosophers' books, right? That's my selfish spell, self speaking up here, right? But this is precisely what makes us anxious because it is all these things that are mine whose decay, degradation, and destruction I am especially anxious about. So the more I enmesh myself in this belief that I am an enduring self, the more I enmesh myself in these various ensnarements, right, of desire and attachment, well, I'm making myself anxious. I make myself angry, right? Because when I lose things, I think something precious has been taken away from me, right? So Buddhism is dedicated to, in some ways, opening our eyes. Look around you, pay attention. Do you think anything in this world can endure? Do you think anything is actually dependent of anything else? So there's a sense in which the Buddha is really asking us to a kind of intellectual, deep philosophical realization of who and what we are and what the nature and condition of the universe is. If we really were to get it, would we really behave the way we are? That's why I use the example in the book. You know, the surgeon who's done the surgery on someone's eyes, right?
Mm.
And you take the bandage off and you ask the patient, can you see? The patient says, yeah, I can see. And then they walk right into a table. You're like, nah, dude, you can't see at all. Because you sure don't behave like someone who has a pair of eyes. So people say that the stuff that Buddhism says is obvious. It's obvious. Yeah, I get it. Stuff doesn't endure. Yeah, I get it. Everything is interdependent. Yeah, ooh, cosmic wholeness, man. But you're not behaving like you really get it. Or you think you can inure yourself from the blows that the Buddha was the most concerned about. Or you think that this this dukkha of yours, this dissatisfaction of yours will not manifest itself in the various kinds of pathologies that we call death, war, hatred, right? I think this is why, the various Buddhist traditions over the years have sought not just individual betterment, but in some ways kind of a global or a community-wide development in some ways, right? Because our happiness is in some ways interdependent upon the happiness of all other living souls, right? And so hence the Eightfold Path, because it puts us towards the only kinds of actions and ways of thinking that can deliver us from dukkha. The path is long and arduous. It might take us an entire lifetime. The Buddha was quite aware of the fact that not everybody was going to become a monk, right? The folks who came to his sermons, they didn't go home and say, "Sweetheart, I'm off to the retreats. I'm going to become a Buddhist monk." No, it was understood that people were going to take care of their lives. So Buddhist practices had to be integrated into people's lives as well, right? And I think has been its appeal over the years, that people feel they can try to come to the realizations that the Buddha was concerned with, right? Which hopefully will reconcile us to the fact that we are mortal, our lives are limited, right? And that we are mistaken in expecting certain kinds of solidity from the world that it simply cannot give us, right? There's a kind of magical thinking we are engaging in if we haven't delivered ourselves from those delusions in the way that Buddhism understands them.
Yeah, we certainly haven't. So let's talk about existentialism now. I am having a little trouble. The sound is quite low, and so if that is the case for everybody that's listening or watching, just know that in post, I'm going to be able to amp up the volume on Samir's end if it's mostly for
Sure,
Samir,
great.
or Samir's side. So if if you come back to this, again, listen to the actual audio episodes, and even the future video episode will fix the audio, so it will be a little more elevated in the volume, in case and that's hard for some of you to hear. All right, so existentialism. So we don't really have time to go through all of the existentialists, but maybe you could choose one who you think to be the kind of paradigmatic existentialist thinker who encapsulates kind of the heart of the existentialist view of anxiety.
Great. That's a hard call, but I'll try to be quick in this description, because I think there are one way that you could do this is that you could start with a kind of chronological forebear, someone like Kierkegaard within the 19th century European tradition, who is concerned with understanding anxiety as a kind of signal to us that we're kind of a mixture of the spiritual and physical, right? If we were spiritual creatures, we would be like angels, gods. We would exist in heavenly domains. If we were entirely physical creatures, then we wouldn't have this sense that I can make choices, that I have certain kinds of capacities that I do not fully understand, and that I, in some ways, bring myself into being through my choices as I make of myself, right? So Kierkegaard understands anxiety as it's a fear of an unspecified thing, right? The future, in some ways, which is, as it were, unwritten, unspecified, waiting to be defined or made by who? Not because there's some predetermined script laid out, right? Which is the kind of understanding that Sartre also takes from Kierkegaard, but as the sense that I will be stepping into this domain, choosing myself in the process, and as a result, determining my future. So there's this very dynamic sense in which, as I take each step into the future, it's those choices and actions of mine that are determining not just the world as it is, but myself. I'm bringing myself into being. And in some ways, this is my existential responsibility. right?
Mhm.
And if I'm unwilling to accept this freedom, if I know that the freedom or the boldness or the braveness to make choices is not being exercised by me, then I sink into despair, right? Hence, you have this Kierkegaardian book, right? The classic Sickness Under Despair, which is that I'm aware of my existential responsibilities, but I'm not acting on them, right? Anxiety is the feeling that this heavy responsibility for the making of myself, for the determination of my future, this rests upon me. The reason this is quite as shocking and appalling as it is because it exists within a cultural context which believed that in some sense there was a kind of historical understanding of our place in the universe. There was an unrolling of the script, so to speak, right? That we were born into this world with certain kinds of capacities or essences, and our task was to just kind of bring them to being, right? There was some way that we were. And to find out who we were was a matter of discovery, right? And I think the existentialists, what they did is, in its broadest sense, if I was to attach a slogan to them, is that they changed the notion of who we are from being a matter of discovery to being a matter of invention. You're not going to find out who you are. You're going to make yourself into who you are, right? So now there's something quite scary about this because I'm just going to find out who I am. Then I can just sort of expect the film or the script or the reel to kind of unfold, right?
Mhm.
Let me just kind of sit back and watch this movie play out. But if I have to make myself, well, then I can't really rest at any given moment. There's always a choice to be made. There's always the unspecified future that has to be clarified. You find this in Kierkegaard, you find this in Nietzsche in different ways, you find this in Sartre, right? I think this is one tradition within existentialism, and I think it's the one that people mostly think about, is that existentialism says we're free, we're scared of our freedom. When we're scared of our freedom, well, we sometimes flee into the arms of those things that will guarantee us solidity. Here's the book.
Yes.
This tells you what to do. This tells you what's going to happen. This tells you what you need to do starting in the mornings, going all the way till the evening. Follow this path and all will be good, right? This is the way in which we sometimes understand the flight to, for example, organized religion. Nietzsche also
Mhm.
saw in this a flight to totalitarianism, into nationalism, into what he called the new idols. You just want to be able to stand with your hand over your heart and promise allegiance to something which will guarantee the future for you. If it's not God, well, then it's your nation, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's ironic when people think about Nietzsche. Sometimes they think he's sort of the patron saint of fascism, but in some sense he was warning us against the kind of nihilism that leads to fascism and totalitarianism that makes us seek refuge in nationalism. This anxiety that I have something secure the future for me, right? And I think by a similar token, I think the other existentialist tradition in people like Tillich and Heidegger, who I talk about in the book, the fear of death is a very powerful regulator of my life in the sense that my failure to realize that my life has a certain kind of termination of possibility written into it is making me live inauthentically. I live as if I've got forever to make over, to do things right, to live properly, to live truthfully. Nope. And I think this is where the urgency sometimes that people associate with these kinds of, live each day as if it's your last. This is a kind of a bumper sticker version of the notion that if you really thought about what the end of your life entailed in some ways, right, which the Stoics also ask us to do, to reflect on this, you would live your life differently. There's also in here a failure of realization. You're not really thought through what it really entails. And if you combine that with the possibilities, right, which Kierkegaard says we should let ourselves become educated by, then you really find yourself in a bind. That there's a sense in which it places a certain sort of urgency upon the need to start thinking about what we want out of existence, this one shot we've been given, right? And whether, as Nietzsche would say, whether we need to really live our lives bound by the models of the world that others have constructed before us. Those were ways in which other people assuage their anxieties. Why are you making your life miserable because of its failure to follow the script written by others before you, right? This is the kind of radical independence that Nietzsche promises us. Free yourself of these shackles. And I think there is something quite deep about this, because one extreme of this is, of course, the sociopath, the person who doesn't care what others think about him. But I think there's a way in which we are made deeply socially anxious by the fear of disapproval, by the fear of not meeting cultural ideals of success or performance, or the number of romantic partners we have, or how much money we make. And I think social media has driven this anxiety to almost unbearable levels for most people, to the extent that we want to shut off our phones, right?
Mhm.
So I think the existentialists have a rich tradition. It's quite diverse. Um, they make us think about the strangeness of life, right? That all of this is covered up with a certain kind of meaning that we have ascribed to things. But there are times when we step back and we notice there's something quite strange about this, because we could have done it in many different ways. And that makes us anxious too, because we sense there is a lack of a solidity to the way in which we have formed and organized our world as well.
It seems like there's a lot of kind of insights that are sort of fruitful in kind of understanding a little bit of the reactive politics that we're experiencing right now.
Yes.
And as you were speaking, also it just it's ironic and sort of tragic, right? That it seems we're either stuck between the anxiety of not being able to fit the framework and kind of all the various social sanctions that are accompanied by not properly fitting in. And then on the other side of it, if we when we get too free, we're also anxious about our, endless freedom and kind of the
Exactly.
overwhelming kind of abyss of that. And here we are straddled between two poles of anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it points out the difficulties in ever finding a state where we'll be free of anxiety. So I would say actually part of our task in some ways in living with anxiety is knowing the triggers for various kinds of anxiety, to hopefully inspire us to, treat others in ways that reflect our need and their deeply felt need for love and respect, right? And the importance of deep and abiding connections with other human beings. Because if we can assure ourselves of love in this world, it does remove, or it does help ameliorate one of our deepest fears. I think there's a reason why the deepest religious traditions have stressed the universality of brotherhood and love, because it is understood what kinds of anxieties underwrite our sense that we are all alone in this world, right? So I think there is that notion, and there is also a sense in which if we are aware of the fact that our existential conditions are not going to change, if we're not going to make our time infinite, right? If those basic parameters cannot change, then we need to reinterpret them, right? There's a sense in which the unalterable conditions of existence, to deny their reality, to attempt to run away from them, that's that's a kind of recipe for neurosis. And I think in that sense, to when sometimes people speak of taking a philosophical attitude towards it, they sometimes seem to have in mind a kind of a resigned or a fatalistic attitude, right? Philosophical means being resigned or fatalistic about it. But I think it's being philosophical about something is to understand that if I'm in an undesirable situation, I really only have three options. I can either escape that situation, I can change it, or I can understand it differently, if I cannot do either of these two things. And existence is like that. If I cannot escape existence, and there are people who decide that they will escape existence when it becomes unbearable, right? And that's a fraught topic in itself when people decide to end their lives. Camus said it was the most important question of all, right? And sometimes we choose to change it, right? We become prophets, teachers, activists, we modify the world, right? We inquire with science, right? We engage in eros with the world. We interact with it in an attempt to change it. But we also attempt to change how we understand those things that we cannot change. I will, if there is a, if there's a leak in the roof and I'm stuck with it through the night, it's there's a reconceptualization of what that unchanging reality is going to be like, right? And I think where hopefully thinking about anxiety philosophically does that, is that it helps us understand it's this thing, it's this perennial thing. It has underwritten even wonder, right? When I say the root of philosophy is, Hobbes says this in the in the Leviathan, that anxiety into the causes of things makes us disposes us to inquire into their origins, right? So, if I see strange phenomena in the sky, I'm like, hey man, what's that bright light? What's this thing that comes up over the eastern horizon every day? It's beautiful. There's wonderment. Yeah, philosophy rises in wonder, but it also rises from a sense of like, I need to understand this quickly. I'm scared. I don't know what this means, right? So that mingling of terror and awe, I think, is part of philosophical wonder. What is this thing? It frightens me. Think about how we deal with the dark. If I step into a dark room, I sort of tentatively push my hands out. I'm terrified that something wet and slimy might encounter it, or something might bite my hands off. But I know that's the only way forward. So I move on, tentatively thrusting into the dark, hoping to find out where I am, right? That attitude is tinged with curiosity, but fear or anxiety of the unknown also underwrites it, I sense. And if you look at the obsession with certainty in modern philosophy, and by this I mean Enlightenment era philosophy in the European tradition, it is obsessed with certainty, right? We need some way of securing certain kinds of beliefs. We need to have something that tells us that certain things we know are absolutely secure. Whether this was moral beliefs, religious beliefs, right? And if you look at the history of that period of philosophy, there is, I would say, a kind of a palpable almost anxiety which is centered around the drive to find certainty, right? So I think thinking about these ways in which it has been around, ever present, but we could be making it worse, I think that gives us a nice little balancing act, because it says, yeah, we should do something about this, but we should also be humble, acknowledge the limits of how far we can go with our anxiety treatments, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I'd love to speak a little bit about, because you're also in your bio, it says that you are a philosophical counselor in addition to being professor emeritus of a couple of universities. And so I want to speak about this idea of philosophical therapy. And but I also want to just interject here about questions. We are getting towards the end of the interview, so if you do have some questions, then please put them in the chat so that I can look to the chat and see if there's anything you'd like to ask Samir. This is a very rare opportunity to actually help me with the questions. So if you have some questions for Samir based on anything we've been discussing, then please do go ahead and put those questions into the chat box now. And then after this next question, I'll check to see if there's any there. So yeah, and so yes, so basically this notion of philosophical therapy, I'm just curious about the technicalities of it. I mean, obviously we know most people know of various forms of talk therapy, and I've looked into philosophical therapy before, but I guess where I struggled was kind of thinking that reasoning alone is sufficient to sort of resolve our various anxieties, right? We see kind of in some traditions, especially that have something to say about the contemplative, the effects on the nervous system of contemplative practices like meditation and breath work, that there are sort of like layers of our kind of subtle self that can be attended to more below the threshold of our conscious mind with these kinds of techniques. And so if we're just working on that kind of just philosophical kind of discursive reasoning register, then one could argue that we're not kind of getting to those lower, I don't know, homes of anxiety, like the
Correct.
traumas that are living kind of in these below the threshold of cognition types of areas. So I'm curious, I imagine you have kind of a response for that in terms of how philosophical counseling can actually hold space for that that level of anxiety below simply our ideas about anxiety in the world.
Great. So first of all, that's a really rich question, and I find myself wanting to answer along three different axes. So first is the relationship between what people call psychotherapy and philosophical counseling. So quick etymology lesson. Psychotherapy comes from the Greek psyche and therapia. Psyche means soul, therapia means healing. Psychotherapy means soul healers. And surprise, surprise, or perhaps not surprise, in the early writings of the different philosophical traditions, and this is true of both Eastern and Western, the variants of this kind of term are used to apply to philosophers and to the notion of philosophical reflection. In fact, the Buddha is explicitly called the great healer. This is present in the ancient Greek tradition as well. And the so that's one just sort of point that in a sense philosophy has always been understood, even by the folks who philosophized, as a way of bringing, as I think of it, are bringing our souls and minds into harmony with our lived lives, our existence, and not, and and I think through reflection is one way of thinking about it. But I would say, just as there are more, I would say, arrows in the philosophical quiver than just reflection,
Hmm.
because I think my conception of philosophy is also a little bit perhaps broader than what academic departments might have us believe. This, and I think that's reflected in my choice of traditions. And I have psychoanalysis, critical theory,
Yeah.
theology, and Buddhism in there. So these are philosophical for different reasons. They ask us to approach anxiety in different ways. And philosophical counseling, similarly, I would say, is committed to the notion, first of all, that philosophy is supposed to help us live a better life by helping
Hmm.
us understand ourselves, our place in existence, helping us answer some of the problems that are vexing. One of these frustrations that people have with philosophy is that it doesn't seem to answer any questions. Well, that's because all the easier questions have been taken over by the other disciplines, right? I mean, the question of what's that bright,
That's
right?
such a good point.
That question of what's that bright light in the sky admits of a fairly definite answer, and we have an
Hmm.
academic field that will answer that question for you, right?
Hmm.
If you want to know how to save up money for retirement, we have an academic field dedicated to that. Now, take all your unanswered questions that are left over by all these academic disciplines. Well, that's what philosophy is concerned with, right? So it's a kind of evolutionary history. Philosophy has just been left with all the unanswered questions, right? Now, why do I mention this? Because the most perplexing questions about how to live our life, questions having to do with value, questions having to do with who we take ourselves to be and how we expect to be treated and how we think our life should be lived, these are philosophical ones. And in fact, what we call mental disorders, and at least in some of their forms, in very often inquire what I would call crises in the kinds of resolutions of these philosophical questions that we find in our life. I'm married to the wrong person. I have a terrible relationship with my children. I have anxiety about my prospects in life. If we were to engage in what I would call a sense of what kinds of fundamental questions might lie at the root of our confusions in these, then there's a sense in which we become transparent to ourselves, wholly, partially, right? We acquire a better understanding of our beliefs and values and motivations. All of this sounds a lot like psychotherapy, and that's not surprising. All psychotherapeutic traditions, psychoanalysis, of course, is the best example of this, but all the other traditions that grew out of psychoanalysis and many other independent ones, they all have a couple of things in common. They have a conception of the human person that they are working with, they have a conception of the human mind, they have a theory about where the person is located with respect to the rest of the world. They pay importance to history. They stress self transparency, inquiry into ourselves. And the methods in varying across different traditions, from psychoanalysis, couch, sort of unending stream of consciousness discourse in the way that Freud originally conceived of it, to something like Socratic dialogues, where we question assumptions, make transparent chains of reasoning. So something like cognitive behavioral therapy, right, which is quite widely accepted as a kind of practical psychotherapeutic modality, this is quite transparently borrowed from various kinds of Stoic and Buddhist techniques, right? What happens when you get angry? What thoughts do you find going through your mind? When you think that your mother in law hates you, what do you do next? You isolate the chain of reasoning, you pick the point of intervention at which that chain of reasoning can be interrupted, and then you work on it as a kind of Aristotelian skill. You practice getting this, and you behave yourself into better moods, right? So I would say there are similar theoretical commitments in philosophical counseling. There is a model of the human mind that you're working with, there's a model of the human person. There is a theoretical commitment to the idea that there is a relationship between beliefs and emotions. So if I believe that there is a snake in the room, I will be scared and I will take defensive measures. When I switch on the light and find out that it's just a coiled rope, I will relax and my temperature will return to normal and I will stop being so frantic, right? Nothing has changed in the world, but my beliefs about it have. So my emotions have changed in correspondence, right? So in some ways, to be a philosophical counselor is to be engaged in a dialogue with someone. And you can tell me what the similarities to psychotherapy are. You're engaged in a dialogue with someone. Someone has given you a certain presentation of a problem, and you want to know more. And you want to know more about what sorts of beliefs and values underwrite these kinds of situations that you find ourselves in. You want the person to understand themselves, who they are in some ways, this lofty ideal of self-transparency, right? And of course, we have theoretical resources at our disposal in the sense of you can bring explicit philosophical commentary into a session, but it could just be something implicit that's guiding you. For example, in the 4 years of practice that I worked as a counselor, it's become clear to me that when people come to me where they have unresolved conflicts in their lives, I should help them resolve those through exercising agency and choice, because I have a commitment to viewing persons as agents, right? Who are trying to find themselves and to do justice to their uniqueness. So I think there's extreme specificity to the work I do because, I am who I am with the particular backgrounds that I have. And I think this is another really interesting feature about psychotherapy, which is some of the most detailed studies that have been done on the various psychotherapeutic modalities about why they work and how they work. We're not surprised perhaps to find out that it doesn't quite matter, that in some ways the theoretical background of the practitioner is not as important as what I think sometimes practitioners like to call the space that gets created between the client and the practitioner. And I think that's typically when you are able to reconcile visions, where you are able to help people find ways forward because you have heard them, seen them, right? I think if I was to truly get as close to religious as I would ever be, I would say something like someone that is seeking counseling or someone that is seeking psychotherapy, they made certain important maneuvers already. They've decided to perhaps seek help. They made themselves the agent of that change, right? So you can think of yourself as a facilitator or a guide as well, right? Sometimes folk need resources pointed out to them. I think the differences in the people that come to counselors seeking help, they determine the kinds of philosophical resources that you bring to bear upon that particular encounter, right?
Okay, but I guess are you like providing readings? Are you like prescribing like meditation practices? Like what does a
You
session
know,
look like? What are the components of it?
Right. So I would say the components of a session, to provide readings would be if in some ways there is a relevance of that approach where you think that someone would actually, benefit from engaging with a text in a particular way, because that's not for everybody. So that is in some ways coming to know whether somebody could really benefit from that kind of engagement. I've had a couple of, clients, people with whom I've worked with, whom I've directed to sometimes just a poem or a short story, right? I taught a class for many years at Brooklyn College where we dealt in philosophical issues through literature. And I do tend to believe that moral theory can often be taught better through literary treatments, because they have philosophical content. But sometimes it can be that sometimes a client says something which makes you think that a theoretical encounter would be useful. And at that point, you might quote unquote prescribe a text, so to speak, or you might say this is something relevant to think about, or here is a line. What do you think follows from this? Right? I think of poets. Poets make us look at the world in a particular way, right? Philosophers do that too. They can suddenly make you think about something in a particular way. And sometimes introducing that can be, I think all psychotherapists will tell you the two most important things that happen in any psychotherapeutic encounter are insight and interpretation.
Mm,
And both of those are available to us from the philosophical tradition,
mm,
right? And so my task is to engage in a dialogue. And of course, what people tell me can prompt further questioning from my side. So I would say there is one, perhaps, sometimes I would say a difference of style. I'm engaged, I interact, I ask questions, I'm curious, because I think in my asking people questions about the kinds of things I might be interested in knowing about them is also an opportunity for them to be able to examine those things with me, right?
mhm.
And to make certain kinds of beliefs and values transparent is to also be able to question them, right?
Yeah.
That's where sometimes there's this pragmatic approach to life, right? The beliefs we have are our rules for action, right? There are tools for manipulating the world. And so there's a sense in which you can ask ourselves whether the lives we want to live are going to follow from the kinds of beliefs and values that we have adopted. Have you chosen the right tools for this task, so to speak? Right? How's that working out for you? Right? That can also be part of the realization that someone might come to. And that's, I think that's a very fundamental task, right? Given that I
Yeah.
believe in these things, can I really live the life I want to live? Right?
I mean, I think
Yeah.
I appreciate so much about what you're saying, and I mean, it really resonates a lot with my experience. I think just I mean, I also my graduate training was in Western philosophy originally before I kind of turned to Indian traditions, and I now in retrospect I turned to philosophy, I think, because of a spiritual crisis, like losing my faith in God at a young age and kind of seeking sort of the fulfillment of that void, and thinking that some sort of like philosophical fulfillment would kind of satiate that felt need that I had. And in some ways it did, right? There was something utterly therapeutic about understanding the world, and I think through philosophy. And I think that's an underappreciated strategy, by means of which to kind of ameliorate. And it's not the only one, right? And this is what I think touches on a question that was asked by Joan, who mentions that as a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, what you say is cogent and fascinating, but regardless of why the anxiety, if it's bad, really bad, if it's bad, really bad, some medicine or now some plant medicine
Yeah.
can help. I think I know what your view is, but I feel like just by way of asking the question, I'll mention that I think what came to me just reading your book, and what kind of comes to me now, is just this sense of that we're by over kind of contracting kind of how we look at anxiety purely to this kind of medical view, let's call it. We miss the various components where it's connected essentially to a search for meaning in our lives,
Right.
and understanding kind of whether it's ontological pictures of the way things work, or it's kind of a almost, I don't know, literary philosophical adventure. There's these other ways in which we can enter into a relationship with our anxiety. So yeah, perhaps you want to speak to
Yes,
Joan's question.
I did want to. I have a section in my book where I am, where I engage in what I would call a species of psych-critical writing, right? And I think it's a quite a common strand in psych-critical writing to be critical of the medication regime, the medicalization of mental illness. These are common critiques that are out there, and I perhaps in some sense I'm sort of chiming in, so to speak. But two or three points in response to Joan's question. First of all, I think there are species of anxiety that are crippling, that render us dysfunctional. And in some cases, I would say, when I say functional, I don't mean to be glib about it. If I am being unable to discharge my parental responsibilities because I'm incapable of doing certain things, then I think medication is a good thing, right? There's a way in which it has spun out of control. What I think is, what I think is the relevant note of caution to be struck in this domain is, first of all, we should, as we said, broaden our vision to include an, an existential understanding of anxiety so that we can understand why people will remain anxious, even if they are the most successful people in the world. Like I said, Jeff Bezos cannot protect himself against the fear of death. Neither is he going to be able to prevent a steady stream of messages over the next 20 years informing him that various people he loves are dying. Neither of these two things will his $70 billion protect him from, right? So there's a way in which we need to come to reckoning with our existential condition. And I think philosophy can help. Medication will perhaps free our mind up to do philosophy. And I would be very happy if psychiatric medication makes it possible for me to sit down and read a book, right? That's great. Because then I'll be able to reflect on my condition. So I'm not anti-medication. What I am
Yeah.
against, and I think this is sounds like common sense to me, is anti-glib medication, is a fundamental understanding of anxiety as a medical condition, right? And thirdly, what I would think in some ways is actually the flip side of this. Take these so-called attention deficit disorders that seem to be so rampant in our society. If we really thought about what these people might be experiencing, what these sufferers of ADD might be experiencing, we might find anxiety in there somewhere. I was a very distracted reader for many years following my parents' deaths, right? And I used to be a phenomenal reader of books, and all of a sudden I found I couldn't read books anymore, right? I just couldn't concentrate on anymore. Whenever I would take a test for ADD, I was like, yeah, I have ADD. I have all the symptoms. But why do I have ADD? Am I always distracted and freaked out because I'm anxious, perhaps? Why am I anxious? Now, this calls for greater investigation than just medicating me in some ways, right? And I think within the field of psychiatry, there's an effort to make the treatment of people broader, cultural, religious, social, political, that our medical histories need to be far richer narratives than just some story of, lab results. That's not my medical history, right? There's something broader within it, right? As far as medications are concerned, look, I've taken plenty of medications. I mean, I used to drink a lot. I've smoked a lot of weed in my life, right? uh, we medicate ourselves in various ways to calm our nerves. I quit cigarettes about 15, 20 years ago. I mean, I've sort of run the gambit. Plant medicine, yes. I mean, I've taken, I've investigated, like I like to say, investigated, academically,
Research. It
recreationally.
was research.
Yes, I was doing research on psychedelics. Yes, but more seriously, I think psychedelics have a very important role to play in the treatment of anxiety and depression, precisely because of the fact that, like philosophy, psychedelics offer us new and vantage perspectives from which to view our place in this world. They change, and they do so in a way which marries emotions and rationality. I have a paper out on this, which is forthcoming in a collection on philosophical perspectives on psychedelic psychiatry, and I hope Joan will look at that volume. It should be out with Oxford University Press, in which I mentioned the importance of psychedelics in facilitating things like forgiveness, right?
Mm.
Because I'm able to view people in my psychedelic experience in a kinder light. I'm able to view them under different descriptions. This is not just my mother in law who upsets me. This is a 70-year-old woman who's concerned about her daughter, right? There's a very different way of viewing her that makes it possible for me to be empathetic with my mother in law and forgive her. And, all these kinds of complex emotional states that we undergo. And sometimes I think psychedelic treatments can help bring together certain kinds of realizations that can remove certain kinds of fears we have. When I think psychedelics have a very important role to play in the treatment of anxiety because they can remind us of how important certain relationships are. They can remind us of the value of love. They can remind us of the greatest kinds of goods that we have. I don't think this is, I don't think there's anything deep in my saying that the best kinds of goods that are available to us in this existence are that we are able to spend time with folks we love, doing things we enjoy, right? That's about as good as it gets, right? And so I think um, anything that brings us to that state can be a treatment for anxiety in some ways. So actually, to answer
Yeah.
your question, Jacob, when you were asking about getting to those deeper levels, we're embodied beings, right? I think this is partly why in my work I would ask people to not just reflect. If you wanted to have a glib slogan, I would say, everybody should move, everybody should meditate, everybody should be mindful, right? We should bring ourselves into encounters with the transcendent, right? To remove ourselves from the human sphere. So we should go out on hikes. We should stand at the edges of waterfalls, and we should go into forests. We should go to the tops of mountains. Human beings have known this. They've known this, that at some level to seek out the transcendent is to deliver ourselves from this world and its demands upon us. I rock climb. And when I'm climbing and I'm on the rock, it's like, all right, all I'm thinking about now is this thing in front of me, this little nubbin that I need to get my two fingers on, right? So these moments, and I think at some level we know them, we're seeking deliverance from this world's demands upon us, right? So, when you say, is it just reasoning that's going to help me? No. But I think philosophical counseling can make me reflect upon my mind and my state of being in this world, and it might make me seek out psychedelic treatments, right? There's a sense in which these things, I think, the various ways in which we take care of each other exist in harmony. I don't think anybody's going to come to me, do an hour of philosophical counseling a week and have their problem solved. But I can tell them that I think it would be really good if you took yourself out into nature more often, if you ran or moved in these ways, if you did justice to the fact that you are an embodied creature that needs, sleep and good food and needs to move, right? I mean, this is a reflection on the kinds of things we are, the kinds of creatures we are, that reminds us of how we should be taking care of ourselves as well, right? Sorry, that was a really long answer to a perfectly reasonable question.
That's okay. It was
I think
beautiful.
it's
Lots of good nuggets of insight in there. So we should probably wrap up. So but I have one more question that is one that I'm very curious about, and it actually came up as a result of or during the conversation in Boulder. Someone asked you about climate change, and you had a very interesting response, and it really was probably the thing that I took away and really kind of contemplated, because kind of one of the things that I took from what you said was, someone asked basically about the anxiety of climate change, and I guess the difference there is that with regards to certain circumstances, whether they're political or environmental, there's this sense that we have a responsibility to be anxious about this. That actually to not be anxious about this is actually some kind of moral failure. And actually that came from you, that response that we have some kind of weird moral relationship with what's going on that is kind of unique to the circumstance environmental kind of devastation. But it did feel like this individual who was asking this question was like, there was something just metaphysically true about the anxiety of the inevitable destruction of the planet, that there was actually no kind of like space, in which one could inhabit a space outside of, or at least reconcile themselves with that anxiety in a way that was helpful for them. So I was just, curious about this sense of anxiety, not as something that we're looking to kind of relate to differently, to kind of ameliorate it, or to reconcile ourselves to various aspects of it, or to, to soften it, to make it more gentle, to relate to it in this more, empowering way or more illuminating way. But actually this sense that we have now where you have a political obligation to be anxious about these things that are arising and that are happening.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. The word we want to use for that could be anxiety. It could be certain kind of urgency. It could be that we have a duty to respond in certain ways to a kind of emergency that is at hand. And I think really underwriting that question is an acknowledgement of, I think, one of the sometimes or not often enough acknowledged positive aspects of anxiety, right? For example, that anxiety in this case produces a kind of urgency that makes me respond to the emergency at hand. So in this case, being fearful about what might happen if some of the worst effects of climate change were to start kicking in is actually a good thing in this case, right?
Yeah.
I would say parental anxiety is unpleasant,
Right.
but I'm sure it has a great deal. It has some adaptive value in helping us, anticipate all the various possibilities that might befall our child. For example, I said once my daughter was born, I was like, my God, this world is full of death traps, right? I mean, death and immediate harm to my child lurks at every step. But it made me vigilant. It made me into a better parent in some ways. So I think there's a sense in which this animating aspect of anxiety, because it produces disturbance, restlessness, makes me inquire, makes me get up to see what that knocking on the roof is, right? Because I'm alarmed. These are in some ways, I think we know them. Fear makes us respond in ways that keeps us alive, that keeps our families alive, that responds to emergencies. And anxiety also, like I point out, is a valuable source of self-knowledge as well. So maybe in some ways, and this is a kind of a esoteric point perhaps to make, that if, and this is Kierkegaard's point in a way, that if I don't listen to my anxiety, if I don't pay enough attention to it, I might not find out enough about myself, right? There's a sense in which my anxieties tell me something about who or what I am, because not everybody has the same anxieties. So there's a sense in which an investigation into that can proceed via an examination of what makes me particularly anxious or fearful. It reminds me of what my values are in some ways, right? So I think this is getting at what I would consider a kind of value that anxiety might have for us, and a kind of loss that we might suffer were we to get rid of anxiety, if it was possible, right? If we could completely medicate it out of existence, for instance, we might be losing out on something, right?
Yeah.
Because all these attempts to assuage our existence can often be very creative, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of the other thing that I wanted to kind of bring up is just, I mean, insofar as I label what is the motivating agitation of my life anxiety, it is also the source of my creativity. And I think the source of so many people's creativity. I'm sure it's what caused you to write, so beautifully in your book, right? And that seems to be one way of just understanding kind of the gift of our various states of anxiety, insofar as they're not ruling our lives and making it so unpleasant that we're kind of limited in ways that we don't want to be.
Right, right.
Well, this has been such a fantastic conversation, and there were so many other things to talk about. It's such a rich topic, and a couple of the traditions that you explore in your book, Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide, including the chapter on psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis. There's also a lot of exploration of the work of Karl Marx and Herbert Marcuse, and just so much insight, so many different directions we could have gone on. But I feel, so if anybody feels like they want more, definitely get Samir's book, Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide, available at a bookstore near you or Amazon. And it really is a wonderful book. It's a beautiful read, not too long, so you can get through it probably fairly quickly, but it's the perfect size in my opinion, and really just like a treasure trove of insight and beautiful, thoughtful explorations of this concept of anxiety from a variety of perspectives. So Samir, to close, is there anything that you'd like to kind of end on, anything related to sort of what we've spoken about that you feel like we could tie up in a certain way, or any closing remarks?
I just wanted to say thanks for having me on. I think every time I talk about anxiety and philosophy, I think, there are dimensions of it that sort of come to light even as I talk about it. So I always appreciate these moments. I think one thing that has happened in my speaking of anxiety is that I've become more and more concerned about the centrality of, of our need for love. I think it's an often ignored aspect, but it seems to me to be popping up more. There's been discussions about, loneliness and alienation. So I do think there is, I think there is something I'd really want people to take away from this book is to reflect on our ontological conditions, to reflect on our existential condition, to be cognizant of it, to accept it, and then work to make our lives be such so that, from that Buddhist sense, we acknowledge the rawness of the need of love that we all have and be frank about it, and really try to understand how it underwrites so much of the suffering that we see today, right? There are, like I said, there's no deliverance from anxiety. There's a living with it. And I think in that living, we have resources. The world is beautiful. We have love. We have great books to read, words of wisdom. There's nature out there that we can get out and, take a look at it and put ourselves into contact with the sublime. So, there's a sense in which I'm like, there's no cure, but there is reason for hope, right? So I think that's the best place to close this on.
Yeah, thank you for ending on love. I think that's the best note to end on.
Yes, that's right. I
And
always tell all my clients, like I'm going to lay my theoretical cards on the table. We need to acknowledge our need for love. It's so important, right?
absolutely. And also, I appreciated so much what you said about expanding kind of the conception of philosophy. That is definitely
Very
something
much
that is
so.
an idea really important to me. And I remember speaking to someone about, being able to incorporate almost like contemplative practices as under sort of the banner of the philosophical thought experiment, right? So that we can kind of, because to me, what is interesting is this capacity, this possibility of actually using what I'd call like embodied epistemologies in order to cultivate,
Yes,
states
yes.
of knowledge within
Ways of
ourselves
coming to know the
below.
world. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's nice to hear of other people who actually did work within the academic philosophical environment, having those aspirations for a philosophy that might be a little more expansive and embodied.
We should talk about this. There's a couple of topics I have running through my mind about stuff we could do if you ever talk again, and
Yeah, that would be
stuff on
fantastic.
psychedelics and forgiveness, and the stuff on a broader conception of what it means to be philosophizing, and I think how it relates to something that would be connect to the concept of actually living a philosophical life or a philosophically informed life. I think those could be, topics for a conversation
I
sometime.
love that, Samir. That sounds like a great lecture plus Q&A for you to
Let
come do at Embodied
me let me write
Philosophy.
it up. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, like I said,
Let's do
it's
it.
great to be
All
able
right.
to. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I will definitely, I'm going to reach out to you after this and get you on the books. So
Thanks.
besides your future talk that you're giving on living a philosophical life, what else would you like to share with the listeners, the viewers, about what's coming up for you. I know you'd mentioned a book. Is there anything that you'd like to point
Yeah,
people in the direction of?
I have. I'll be speaking at a Smithsonian online event in November. I'll be speaking at the University of Dayton in November. I'll be doing a couple of podcasts in the next couple of months. I'm online at samirchopra.com, which is my my site for anyone that wants to get in touch with me. And I hope to be doing more podcasts on this topic, and especially connecting the topic of anxiety to larger political and cultural issues. Um, and I think that's a topic of some interest to me, and so I think hopefully, yeah, some of those more discussions down the line will come about. My books out there, as you mentioned. There's a few essays of mine. Some of the essays that underwrote this book are out there. If you just search for Samir Chopra anxiety, you'll find those. Yeah, and I
Is
would
there a
love to
website
hear
that
from
you'd like
people.
to share?
Sorry.
Is there a website that you'd like to share?
It's just samirchopra.com. Yeah, that's
Okay.
my sort of my shingle on the net, and they'll find me at Amazon as well. And you can sort of Google Samir Chopra anxiety to find my various writings. I would love to hear from people. If people are here today, they would want to send me emails. I would love to hear from folks. Yeah, so thank you very
What
much.
email should they send it to us, and then I'll forward it to you, or do you want to share an email, Samir?
I could give you an email. Is there a place? I'm just going to put it into my chat. I can see the chat. This is so that's the website, and I'm going to type in my Gmail address as well. Great. Yeah, I think, and I think people should read more philosophy. Like I said,
I agree.
I think it's just it's other human beings like you and me, thinking through life's problems and giving it a go. And we're all
Yeah,
philosophers in one way or the other. So I think we should participate in this tradition of philosophizing that has been ours, right?
I absolutely
Thank you.
agree, and I'm glad you're representing that campaign
Thanks.
for us all to read more philosophy. All right, thank you all so much for joining us on this live edition of the Chitheads podcast. It was such a delight to see so many of you out there. I think at some point it was close to 60, maybe even more. I wasn't looking at all the time, but I did see at one time it was about 55. So thank you very much for joining us. It really is so fun to have a live audience, and we can feel all of your energy, all your anxiety coalescing into a beautiful fever pitch of wonder and love. So thank you all so much for coming and joining us. I have been speaking once again to Samir Chopra, the author of Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide. Samir, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me on, Jacob, and thanks very much to everybody for their feedback and their questions. Thank you. Bye for now.
It's been such a pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody.